We are studying the book of Ruth. And last week, we started to do that. And by the way, if you're grabbing a Bible, either the Pew Bible or the Bible you brought from home, Ruth is kind of close to the beginning of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. So it's on page 253 of my Bible, which means nothing to you. So we started to look at this story last week, and we looked at the story of a woman named Naomi and her husband Elimelech, and they left Bethlehem. They left their hometown because there was a famine, and they went to a place called Moab. So they were leaving the promised land for a place known for rejecting God, known for immorality. And so they've moved into the wrong neighborhood. And they've left behind God's people, and they find themselves there, and her husband, Elimelech, dies. And their two sons end up married to Moabite women, which doesn't mean much to us, but Moabite women had a bad reputation, okay? And there was some reason for that. And so this woman finds herself, Naomi, without her husband, and her boys have married these girls of possibly ill repute. And then her boys both die. And so she finds herself alone, and she decides, I need to go back home. I'm going to go back to Bethlehem. And her daughters-in-law are with her, and, neither of them have had children, and it's a bad situation, especially in that world, where basically if you were barren, that was considered by many a curse from God. If you had been widowed, only your family, like the other men in the family, were supposed to take care of you, but she didn't have anybody else. So she had nothing and almost nobody. She tells her daughters-in-law, go back, stay with your families. Maybe you can find another husband. I mean, who would ever think that you would lose your husband and then God would give you another one? Right, Kim? And one of the daughters, Orpah, goes back, but Ruth says, no, I'm staying with you, which is a crazy decision, because if she went back home, she might be able to depend on her family. She's going with a woman who has nothing. And she says, I will be with you. And they travel the 30 to 50 miles to Bethlehem. And people say, hey, it's Naomi. She says, no, Naomi means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. She's saying, my life, I left Bethlehem full and I'm returning empty. I don't think we can even begin to understand how dark her situation is. And she says, call me Mara, bitter. And I want to remind you from last week that God is there in our Mara moments. In those moments when we're like, I have nothing. My life is broken. God is almighty. God is faithful. And at the end of chapter 1, we have a glimpse of hope, because it says that she arrived in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Now, that doesn't sound really helpful and hopeful, but it is, and we'll see it now. And I'm not going to read this scripture. We're just going to walk through it together. I'm not going to read it as a whole. Let's walk through the story. Verse 1, now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. At this point in the story, we have had two characters, Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. And they show up back in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem, and we don't know why Boaz matters, but the author says, oh, and by the way, there was this Boaz who was related, and he was part of the clan of her deceased husband. Now, in that day, the clan was kind of the central reality of the society. Like you had your family, your immediate relatives, but then you had a clan, which was kind of your extended family. And even though you had the tribe, which was even bigger, the clan really knew that they had a responsibility to care for each other. That was the group of people that was going to help out. Now, it says that he was a man of standing. Now, that could mean that he had a good reputation. It could mean that he had a lot of wealth. It could mean he was a good man with a lot of character. But we have this guy, Boaz. And just as a side note, to kind of understand the importance of names, in those days, a name was really important. And later, when Boaz's great-great-grandson Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, he called one of the foundational pillars Boaz, which meant strength. It meant courage. It meant kind of solid foundation. So apparently this is a good man, a solid foundation, but he just mentions it. Then we go on to verse 2. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. Now, there are 4 things that Ruth needs in this chapter, and we're going to see God provide all 4 of them. And if you're taking notes, you'll notice 4 F's there. We won't necessarily give you all 4 right away, but first of all, the most obvious need is food. They have nothing. It's the barley harvest. There's food there, but they have nothing. And normally in this case, your family or your clan would provide for you, but she doesn't have a family or a clan. So I need food. I need a family. I don't have that. No food, no family. And so she says in verse 2, let me go and maybe I will get leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. So because she realizes she doesn't have food or family, she needs favor. Now, a little bit of background here. God had provided a way to provide for the poor. Back in Leviticus 19, God had said, harvesters, farmers, and that was everybody back then, by the way. And he said, when you harvest the fields, I don't want you to scrape up every little bit of food. I want you to kind of leave the corners there. And after you go through and you pick it up once, don't go back and pick up every little grain. He said, I want you to leave that so for the people that are poor, for the refugees. Do not strip your fields bare and leave what is missed in the fields for the disadvantaged people. One commentator mentioned that it was kind of like collecting recycled cans, maybe, in our society, where you're out, okay, well, if I can pick up recycled cans, and by the way, originally coming from Iowa, we have the nickel cans in Iowa. So if you pick up cans, it's worth a lot. But even now, there are people that will go around and pick up some recycling to take in, and maybe you'll get some money. But it's kind of an embarrassing thing to do. It's admitting I have great need and I don't have enough stuff in my life. But she's willing to go out and work. Now, not every farmer apparently followed this command, because God had ordained Israel as his people in order to bless the nations, but they had become really selfish. I know that you bless us, God, to be a blessing, but, I want everything for me. And so she is saying, well, maybe I'll find somebody generous. Maybe I'll find favor in their eyes, and there'll be enough food left over that I'll be able to feed myself and my mother-in-law. And it's interesting, the writer continues to mention to us that she is a Moabite woman. So she's an outsider. She's not, this sweet little lady that everybody knows and everybody cares about. She's an outsider. She's the kind of person that people would say, well, I'm not going to help her. We don't want that kind of person around us anyway. She has no food, no family, no favor. Verse 3, she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. She's walking along, picking up barley off the ground. As it turned out, now I want to stop there. As it turned out, it says, that phrase literally in the Hebrew means it happened to happen. Or we might translate it, as luck would have it. Well, we'll see that it's not necessarily luck. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now, she doesn't know Boaz. There's no sign of that. And she doesn't know that this field belongs to him. She doesn't know him. She doesn't know anything because she hasn't read the book, by the way, okay? We just read the book, verse 1. Oh, no, she doesn't know that. And so we begin to see, oh, God's got something planned. God's doing something. I was thinking back in my life. I was in college and I was studying economics. And my plan was that after I finished college, I was going to go to the London School of Economics and get a PhD in economics. Because that's the way you think of me, right? I seem like a PhD in econ. And then I was going to come back and maybe go to law school, and I was going to work for international financial organizations doing international law and finance, which pays about the same as being a pastor, I think. And then the summer before my senior year in college, I felt like, okay, my life is going to be really serious for the several years, so I'm going to go work at a summer camp for the summer. And I ended up at Camp Manitoqua, which I'd never heard of, outside of Frankfort, Illinois. And God messed up my plans. God said, this is what I want you to do. And I went back to college and I changed my major in the fall of my senior year. Now, if you don't know much about college, that's a bad idea, okay? And I'm finding myself in this situation, so I thought, well, if I'm going to do ministry, I bet I should find a church to get involved in. So I went to the chaplain at the college, and they told me, oh, well, it just so happens that this church in town just called the day before, and they are looking for a college student to help with their youth group. I said, okay. So I went over there and I walked in, and it just so happened that the pastor was not thoughtful enough to send me away. And I ended up at this church, and they took care of me. It was a blessing. It was an incredible thing. So I was there for a few years after college, and I was doing youth ministry, and God had clearly brought me there. And then I said to Julie one day, I think I need more education. So I want to go to seminary. I've heard about this Trinity Seminary in Deerfield, Illinois. I want to go there. That's the place to go. And we'd been married just for a few months, and we had no clue. She was still finishing her undergraduate degree, and we were just going to move to Chicago because it's free, right? And it just so happened that one of our good friends at that church where I was working had been out to visit his parents the weekend before, and the church where they were in Chicago had announced they were looking for a part-time youth pastor who was maybe going to seminary. So it just so happened that I ended up at this church in Elmhurst. And that was awesome, and they took care of me because, as I said, we had no clue. I mean, here was our financial plan. Think about this for a moment. I was going to go to seminary at the most expensive seminary in the United States. Julie was going to finish her undergraduate degree at this private college on the same campus. I was going to work part-time as a youth pastor, making, get this, $10,000 a year. And the math was going to work out. But, God put us at a church where there were a lot of people that took care of us financially. One time we realized we were $49.50 overdrawn because we'd written some checks, and it was going to bounce. And we were $49.50 overdrawn, and I got together with our chairman of elders. I didn't initiate it. Cal called me and said, hey, I want to buy you lunch. And he said, oh, and by the way, it's Christmas coming up. I wanted to give you this as a Christmas present. He hands me a $50 bill. It just so happened that God provided. I got close to the end of my education at Trinity. That's a long story, which some of you are, you don't want to hear it. But I'm like, okay, it's time for me now to find a church where I can do full-time ministry. And I thought, what would be perfect is if God found a church where I could do youth ministry, because that's what I do, but also I could work with a godly, experienced pastor who would kind of mentor me and help me to know kind of how to do ministry. And maybe if he's approaching retirement, I would transition into the pastorate. Well, it just so happened that Julie had finished her undergraduate degree, and she got a job. She looked all over, and she had good grades, and she interviews well, and she's beautiful, which has nothing to do with it, but I just want to mention it. And she got a job. We were living in Elmhurst. She got a job in Lansing, which meant an hour on the tri-state every day. But it just so happened that a friend of ours from our church there was driving down to teach at Lansing Christian every day. It just so happened. And it just so happened that when I called somebody and I said, hey, I'm looking for a church where I can do ministry, and I'm kind of looking for this kind of situation, youth ministry, and I can do, some preaching and kind of grow into big people ministry. And Cor, who was on the phone, said, oh, it just so happens that I just got off the phone with the pastor at a church in Lansing, Illinois, describing the exact job you're talking about. He said, yeah, but it's like an hour away. Do you know anybody in Lansing? I said, well, my wife just started teaching in Lansing. It just so happened. It just so happened. It just so happened. It just so happened. And, those are blatant, and I know I spent a lot of time on that. But I want you to know this kind of thing happens all the time, and we don't see it. Somebody said once that the providence of God is kind of like Hebrew. In order to understand it, you have to read it backwards. Because that's the way the Hebrew language works. Instead of reading left to right, they go right to left. And sometimes we have to get past things to be able to look back and say, it just so happened, it just so happened, it just so happened. There's a sovereign God at work, and sometimes we don't see it. And I think sometimes we will never see it until we're in heaven. And then we look back and we say, I see what God was doing. So we go on to verse 4. She's out in the field, and Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. Now, just a side note, notice that the knight in shining armor, the salvation, the solution to her problems is coming from Bethlehem. Just saying. I want you to notice that. And Boaz greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseers of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? Now, in ancient Middle Eastern literature, a character's first words often are meant to give you a window into that person. And so the author of Ruth says, the first thing out of Boaz's mouth is, the Lord be with you. Now, he doesn't ask, who is that woman? He asks, whose is that woman? Because a person belonged to a clan, not slavery, but he's asking, who does she belong to? Who are her people? And part of what he's asking is, who should be providing food? I mean, she's walking behind the harvesters. Who should be taking care of her? And the overseer replied, she's a Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves. She came into the field and has remained there from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Now notice in verse 6, he mentions Moab twice. She's a Moabite woman. She came from Moab. And she asked, and so it's almost like he's apologizing for letting her work in the field. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." Now, this is crazy good stuff. We might not see it, but I mean, this is beyond all expectations. She, as a woman from Moab, that's like a woman from like a Packers fan or something like that. I say that because Al's a big Packers fan. But she could expect to be mocked, ridiculed, looked down on. In fact, she would possibly, very likely, be abused by the men. But Boaz says, don't go, don't leave, stay here with the women. In fact, the word there for stay here with the women is cling to them. It's just like last week, Ruth said to Naomi, I will not leave, I will cling to you. And that's the same word that Genesis uses to say, a woman shall leave her father and mother, and she shall cling to her husband. So she's saying, he's telling her, grab on, you belong here. And anybody that says that Christianity degrades women has not read the Bible. Because he is saying, look, the hero of the story is saying, you matter to me. In fact, he calls her daughter and he protects her. In fact, the last thing she needs, food, family, favor, and the last thing she needs as a woman in that society is she needs a fortress. She needs protection is probably a better word, but protection doesn't start with an F. So she needs a fortress, something that will protect her. Now, I think it's important, as we turn the corner here, for us to ask ourselves, what do we look for to provide those things in our lives? When we need protection, when we need provision, when we need a family, when we need people. I guess I could have done all P words too, couldn't I? But where do we look for that? And Boaz is saying, stay here among my people where God has brought you, and I will provide. So, verse 10, she bows down. She asks him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me? I'm a foreigner. That should be the natural response to this kind of mercy, grace, kindness. We should be like, God, what did I ever do that you would love me? Goes on in verse 11, Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Boaz is pouring out blessing on Ruth, but he's also reminding us what God is like. He's saying, may you be rewarded by the Lord, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Psalm 91:9 says, if you say the Lord is my refuge and you make the Most High your dwelling, these things will happen. So my question to you is, where do you look for refuge? Where do you look for provision? Verse 13 goes on, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of even one of your servants." Then at mealtime, he invites her over. They have bread together. He offered her roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. Basically, their first kind of date. Not quite a date. If you ever have been in that situation in your life where you're like, okay, was that a date? Was it not a date? I'm not really sure. That's what's going on here. We don't know how long it's been since Ruth had eaten all she wanted. But do you see what's happening? Have you ever felt like you didn't fit in? Do you ever feel like, I don't know where I belong, who my people are? I don't know where this is going to come from? Like you were the last one picked in gym class? Ruth is given a place. She got up to glean. Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves. Don't reprimand her. In fact, even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." He's like, spill more, pour out more, pour out more. And so often we say, "God, where is this? I wanted this, I wanted this." And God says, "Look, I am pouring out more," but I think sometimes we don't want to stop and pick it up because, come on, God, that's embarrassing. I always get a little frustrated when somebody says to me, "Oh, can you pray for this pastor, but don't tell anybody because I don't want people to know. I don't want them to think that I'm like asking for attention." And I understand there's a point where you want some privacy. But what if we really let each other know what we needed? Just saying. Verse 17, Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. So I thought, an ephah? I don't know what that is. That's not helpful. Well, I looked it up, and an ephah is about half a bushel. That didn't help me either. So, an ephah of barley is 30 pounds, 5 gallons of food. I mean, it's almost a month's wages for a male worker. And I know we live in the age of, wage equity, but in those days, there was no wage equity, okay? If a man worked and got an ephah for a month, a woman would work 3 or 4 months. She carries it back to town. You can picture her almost staggering along because she's carrying 30 pounds. And her mother-in-law looks down the street and she saw how much she carried. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today?" Or I wonder whether her mother-in-law said, "Who did you mug today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Naomi's like, I don't even know what to say. She's kind of rambling, and she had desperately sent off this young woman that she loves. Now notice, Ruth doesn't know that Boaz is a relative, and Naomi doesn't know that the field belonged to Boaz. And then there's this moment. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. And it's obvious that the writer is trying to make it wait. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. It just so happened. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He's one of our kinsman redeemers. Now we're going to talk about that next week. But basically, she's saying he's a cousin. He's kinfolk. He's our fortress. The key word here is there is kindness, there is grace, there is love from God that is flowing through this family member. And Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her father-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him. Duh. Because in someone else's field, you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. Now, at this point, you're like, wow, Boaz is providing, and it's clear because they use the word hesed, and that means God's loving kindness. It's clear that this is supposed to show us the enormous generosity of the grace and kindness of God. And you're thinking, wow, this is amazing. Look at what's happened. And then there's the climactic sentence that brings it all together. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Oh, okay. Okay, maybe there's more to the story than that. You see what happened? The Lord of the harvest came from Bethlehem and shows the kindness of God to rescue her from a hopeless life. That's the kindness of God. Now, notice what Boaz does. He sees the hurting. He seeks out the hurting. He goes to Ruth, which is weird. And he says, hey, what's your story? He shelters the hurting. He provides for what the hurting needs. Feels a little bit like the prodigal son, if you're familiar with that story. Two applications as we close here. First thing I want to tell you is God comes to us in our Mara moments. In those moments when we are alone and bitter and angry and hurting and unsure and we feel lost, God comes to us in those moments. In fact, many of us know the verse, Ephesians 2, verse 8, says that it is by grace we have been saved through faith, right? Grace is the key word. Well, the Greek translation of Ruth uses that word, grace, to talk about what Boaz is giving her. He gives her grace, favor, food. He gives her grace, favor, protection, a fortress. He gives her grace, favor, a family. He gives her grace, favor, everything she needs. We'll talk about that more next week. But I want you to see that Ruth is in a Mara moment, and God steps into that moment. The other thing that I want to point out is that I think it's very legitimate to say here, God calls us to be the ones who do the same thing. He calls us to be the ones who spread his favor. He told Abraham at the very beginning that all the nations in the world will be blessed through you. Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 5 through 7 says, if you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly one with another, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, if you do not go after other gods to your own hurt, then I will dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your ancestors forever and ever. God says, if you pass on the favor I have given you, I will continue to give you favor. God says, you will run into people who are needy and hurting. Love them, grace them, favor them. You will run into people who maybe don't seem like you. Grace them, favor them, love them. Give them what they need. I mentioned before, and we're going to have an announcement about this next week, but this is a unique situation in the city of Chicago right now. There are 17,000 Ruths staying sometimes in police stations, sometimes at O'Hare, sometimes in tents, in city shelters. And please don't let the politics of this or your opinion about immigration come to this. Here's the truth. There are people who are lost and refugees, and they don't have their people. And many of them are children. They don't know where their food's going to come from. And we are going to have a couple opportunities in the next couple months to Boaz them. And I hope you will prayerfully consider being part of that. Because do you see what God has done? But God's not done. Next week, same bat time, same bat channel. It gets better.